A very good evening to you all. Welcome to Sir Mary Le Beau and to this dialogue or debate. This is one of a number of events that we've organised throughout the year to celebrate 50 years of the rebuilding of this church and to reflect upon some of the themes that have been part of those decades. So I hope that you'll indulge me for a few minutes if I kind of describe the background of the tradition of dialogue. When I bump into people and say that I'm the rector of this church, everybody always says, or a number of people will say, oh, is that the place with the dialogues and the two pulpits? The background of that is when this church was rebuilt in 1964, it was self-consciously a product of something called the liturgical movement, which was in part a pastoral movement, but it was also a scholarly movement trying to revive the conditions of worship from the early Christian centuries. So instead of an elegant replica of a Georgian wren interior, that was abandoned in favor of the defining liturgical features of that movement. So no altar rails, you see here, a single altar forward so that the priest always stands behind, a presbyterium for the clergy and the bishop at the back, and interestingly, of course, two ambos or pulpits, on the south side for the reading of the epistle at the Eucharist, and on the north for the gospel. What is still a bit unclear is how far, in supporting such arrangement, the then rector, Joseph McCulloch, whose likeness you can see up there on the top of that arch, how far he, a very, very, very intelligent, mercurial and talented man, how far he intended to use these pulpits for a series of dialogues, which he proposed and supported over a period of 15 years or more every Tuesday, in which he engaged with the luminaries of the age, A.J. Eyre, Bernard Levin, Joan Bakewell, Margaret Daverill, Jonathan Miller, et al. Very much the church engaging with the world on the world's own terms, which was rather a foreign concept in 1964. Indeed, Richard Harris, lately Bishop of Oxford, or some time ago Bishop of Oxford, recalls that the then Bishop of London described Joe McCulloch as, quote, our only contact with the outside world. Nowadays, of course, every organization supports an institute of one kind or another, and our great collaborator is St. Paul's Institute, who are recording this event for us this evening. And debate and dialogue are pervasive across the nation. But in the late 60s and 70s, what went on here was really quite unique and is the subject of an extraordinary recorded archive in the British Museum. The liturgical movement also envisaged a different conception of the church, no longer just an institution, but rather a dynamic organism of individual disciples, lay and ordained. And this was true of the Roman Catholic and of the Anglican communions. In an encyclical of 1964, 2 months after the consecration here, Pope Paul VI wrote of the need for the world and the church to get to know one another and to love each other. And some trace that word dialogue to the desire of the post-war generation struggling for a language with which to address the memory of the Holocaust. For many, dialogue was the key to the church's task at that time. So what could be more telling than to address the intractability of poverty against the background of budgetary sustainability and some evidence that people in our land are impatient with support for anti-poverty programs overseas. My own background might be described by the standards of today as somewhat impoverished, but blessed with enviable educational opportunity. 2 first degrees without a jot of student debt. I saw poverty in apartheid South Africa, and I was able to attribute that to wickedness and injustice. But in the mid-1980s, when I was a curate in Leeds, the deprivation I encountered in inner Leeds was to some extent dressed up in the dignity of white and Afro-Caribbean cheer. But on one occasion during those years, supervising the distribution of a European butter mountain, and perhaps the Common Agricultural Policy will come into focus tonight, I saw a sort of underclass appearing, none of whom I encountered before or again. And there may have been something about that today when I visited a food bank in Bow, at St Mary Bow, which we here support. So to reflect on the economics, the morality, the efficacy of welfare, and perhaps its reform in the United Kingdom, we are very delighted to welcome the Right Honourable Frank Field, who has been a Member of Parliament since 1979, a luminary of British political and parliamentary life and of Labour politics, noted for rare and fluent independence, and not least for interventions on welfare reform in particular. When in 1997 he was appointed Minister for Welfare Reform, many thought that at last change would come, but that was short-lived, although in an unusual moment of cross-party wisdom, he was given a role by David Cameron, rather oxymoronically, if there is such a word, as poverty czar. Nick Timmins, who's going to speak first, has a wide experience in the theory and practice of public policy making, perhaps the art of the possible. He is the author of a distinguished biography of the welfare state, and he works in part at the King's Fund on reports and policy making, but not least in the area of health and social care. Nick.
Oh, good evening. It's good to be here. I suppose I should start with a confession. When I was the public policy editor of the Financial Times, I tried to avoid using the phrase the poor, not because, of course, they don't exist, but they're quite hard to define. There's no very obvious cut-off point above which you cease to be poor. So I tended to talk about those at the bottom of the income distribution, who are part of a continuum all the way up to those at the very top, who anybody would, of course, define as rich. The problem's partly illustrated about what I'm going to talk about, which is the fall and rise of conditionality, the attachment of conditions to the receipt of benefit. 5th of July 1948, you may well recognise the date, the founding of the National Health Service, the day it came into existence. What's much less well remembered is that on the same day, two other far-reaching pieces of legislation also took effect: the National Insurance Act and the National Assistance Act. The former implemented, though not without flaws, William Beveridge's mighty new system of social security, under which national insurance, paid by employers and employees, provided a bunch of benefits as of right, so long as contributions had been paid, most notably pensions and unemployment benefit. The National Assistance Act claimed in its preamble, in the sort of language you tend not to get in legislation these days, that it, and I quote, terminated the poor law. It didn't, in practice, quite do that. Now, the poor law, or parish relief, of course, goes back to 1601 and carried with it all the stigma of the workhouse and the principle of less eligibility, that conditions in the workhouse had to be sufficiently unpleasant to ensure that people would not voluntarily fall back on it, becoming, in the poison language of the current political debate, shirkers and scroungers. And I guess you don't get much more conditional than less eligibility. But the National Assistance Act provided the means-tested safety net that underpinned Beveridge's national insurance benefits. Very broadly, national assistance picked up those who'd not paid sufficient contributions, largely because they were too sick or too disabled, or because they'd exhausted their entitlement to unemployment benefit. But at the time, there were no conditions attached to the receipt of unemployment benefit. Beveridge had argued that it should be paid without time limit, on the grounds that it was, quotes, wrong in principle to reduce someone's income just because they'd been out of work for a certain period. Most people, he said, would rather work than be idle. However, to prevent that, and to prevent, and I quote, habituation to idleness, and as a means of improving capacity for earning, Beveridge, in fact, had recommended that after 6 months, men and women should be required, as a condition of benefit, to attend a work or training centre, the requirement arriving earlier in times of good employment and later when unemployment was, and later on, beyond 6 months, when employment was high. That, in fact, wasn't implemented, mainly because at the time it simply did not seem necessary. The problem in the 1940s was not one of millions of people claiming. In 1948, there were just 840,000 odd on means-tested benefits, and unemployment was pretty much frictional. The problem was one of huge labour shortages, not one of too many claimants. And anyway, successive governments were to remain committed to using the power of the state to ensure full employment. What did happen, however, was that entitlement to the non-means-tested unemployment benefit was limited to 1 year. Now, there's a vast amount of history between then and now, and I'm technically only got 8 minutes, so what follows is a very crude summary. But to put it very briefly, 5 big things happened over the succeeding 50 years. The first was that means-tested help became more rights-based. The National Assistance Board operated heavily on discretion. Its officers visited people's homes, they viewed their circumstances and their attitudes before providing assistance or not. But by the 1960s, that came to be seen as not just discretionary, but judgmental and demonstrably inconsistent, not just between offices, but between the way individual officers themselves made judgments on cases. So a more rules-based, much less discretionary system emerged. Second, there was a steady growth in the rights of people with disabilities to benefit, not just those with a physical disability, but with, for example, mental health issues. And that, of course, was entirely right. But the widening of the gateway reinforced long-latent suspicion about fraud and abuse. As one former permanent secretary put it, if the condition of benefit is that you have lost your leg, you're not going to get much fraud. If it's things like mental debility and that sort of thing, well, it is going to get shadier. Third, following the oil crisis of the mid-1970s, the policy of full employment broke. Unemployment went through the million barrier, and in the worst recessions hit 3 million or close to it, and long-term unemployment became a reality. Fourth big event was that to massage those unemployment figures, and as great swathes of heavy industry disappeared in the 1980s, coal and steel, a lot of manufacturing, doctors were quietly encouraged to sign people off onto disability benefits rather than much more politically sensitive unemployment benefit. And fifth, globalisation started applying huge pressure to pay in lower paid jobs, even as it spectacularly increased the incomes of those at the top. As a result of 2 of these factors, inequality rocketed, and as a result of all of them, the Social Security Bill, what we now call welfare, grew. The big intellectual response to that came at the end of the 1990s, starting tentatively under the Conservatives, but delivered with vigour by New Labour, one that started to emphasise responsibilities as much as rights, but one which also understood more fully that the taxpayer could no longer focus benefits mainly on those out of work, those who might be dubbed the poor. The focus had also to be on the low-paid who were actually in work. So rather than merely spend money keeping people out of work, Labour hugely extended schemes that supported them in it, with what we currently call tax credits, underpinned by a minimum wage to stop employers cutting wages further to dump the costs back onto the state. In parallel with that move to ensure that low-paid work paid, or to use the political slogan that work always pays, the conditions for receiving out-of-work benefits got steadily tighter. First for unemployment benefit, which by then became known as job seekers allowance, then for lone parents, and then for people on disability benefits, all reinforced by welfare to work programmes. And it's worth emphasising that there's a straight read-through here from the early initiatives of John Major's government through the Labour years and onto the coalition. For all the mighty battles at times around some of the individual changes, and for all the truly hard cases that are sometimes thrown up, not least by the current rearrangements of disability benefits, there's not in truth much fundamental party political difference in the broad direction of travel here. And on the way, and not just because of the changes to benefit conditionality, the national insurance principle has been pretty much destroyed. And as an aside, I'd argue it's probably time to scrap it and merge it with income tax in a though that would be quite a serious undertaking. But the logic of national insurance has disappeared. So just to finish, I'd point out that with universal credit, the single benefit that is replacing 6 others at the moment, we've reached a new branch in the road on conditionality, one that required the state to become much more intrusive than at any point since the 1940s. The current rules for benefit receipt are broadly hours-based. To put it very simply, there's a big kick in entitlement when people work 16 hours a week and again at 24 and 30. And working below 16 is not really worth it, as benefit is withdrawn pretty close, pound to pound, for earnings. Universal credit is very different. It aims to make any amount of work pay, a few hours a week even. And behind that lies a view that the overriding aim of policy should be to have as few households as possible where no one is in work, even if they're earning very little, rather than ensuring that those in work are in rather more substantial jobs. Now, personally, I don't see that as a particularly left-wing or a right-wing view. It's a question of what you believe most matters, and partly how you believe the labour market works, whether a mini-job is a step on the road towards a full-time one. But that approach comes at a price, because to stop people working just a bit, while still being able to claim quite a bit, the benefit system of the future will no longer just hassle people to get into work, it will have to hassle them to work more. In theory, though I suspect not in practice, up to the point where they leave universal credit. So we're moving from what over the last 25 years has been a growing system of out-of-work conditionality to one of in-work conditionality as well. And that's a big change in the relationship between the state and not so much the poor, however you define them, but between the state and the less well-off. And no one, as far as I can tell, is yet very clear how this will work. Benefit officers will be saying to people not just that you must actively seek work and get it, but once in, you must work more hours or get higher pay, when that may not always be in the gift of the individual. So there's, at least in theory, a real prospect of, say, a part-time teacher working 20 hours a week, being told they must work more because they are still entitled to an element of universal credit. And if they do not, what happens? Do you stop the benefit of people in work because they fail to find more work? And will the Department of Work and Pensions remotely have the capacity to do that at scale? And if it does develop the capacity to do that, what will the costs be? Just a question about whether this is a healthy relationship between the state and its citizens. I asked the question. I'm not sure I have the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So after that breakneck and masterly survey of where we have come philosophically and in terms of legislation, where are we going? Frank Field.
I may delay answering the question, where are we going, but really to pick up directly with what Nick has been saying, because this movement of conditionality to almost no conditions, to conditionality again, sums up the period of my activity, both in the poverty lobby prior to going to the House of Commons. So it's 45 years of effort. And I am an unashamed a person in favour of conditionality. And that's been one of the great clashes I've had with the Labour Party. And it's one, even though they appear converted now, I think most people think they're converts of convenience rather than of conviction, and therefore what we say doesn't actually roll with the grain of human nature. But I've got 3 guiding ideas or principles which I've always brought to welfare reform. And the first one directly attacks the view of those who argued against conditionality and who believed that altruism was first and most the best flowering of human nature, and that it could dwell on such a wide expanse that you could build a welfare state and sustain a welfare state on that. I've never believed that for one moment. I believe in Genesis 3, in that we were in the Garden of Eden. that we are fallen creatures, and that we need to take the starting point for our discussions with our fallen natures. As Christians, of course, we also believe in that we will one day be made perfect. So it's a message with hope, but it is also about a journey. And I think Mr. Beveridge, I think, would have agreed with the views that I'm putting out. Who knows to what extent I was really influenced by Beveridge. I mean, it's one of these great people. I mean, Nick's probably the only person in the Western world who's actually read Beveridge. The rest of it is very boring stuff to try to do so. But it means, therefore, that if we are fallen creatures, the great motive forces in us are around self-interest. I have never thought this an unclean term. I think it's a wholesome driving force in human nature, and I believe that we wouldn't have survived as a human race unless central to all of us was self-interest and that motive force about surviving. That doesn't, of course, mean that you can't make a distinction between selfishness, self-interest and selfishness, and you can't make a further distinction between selfishness and greed. Hard to do so in practical terms, but I think when one looks at the published data on city salaries, it's not hard to say that there's greed at work there. It's not hard when you look at individuals' acts to know that they are selfish. And I think it's quite proper to recognise that most of our actions are about self-interest. And William Temple, who was a master of glib statements, said that the job of the politicians was so to direct self-interest that it promoted the public good. And that's certainly something which I believe in. So one principle is that you cannot have unconditional welfare. We are fallen creatures, and if you have unconditional welfare, if you are the Good Samaritan, brilliant to operate it on that individual level, but not one in which you can base the policy for a whole society. Maybe not even for a road, let alone a village or a town, but certainly not cities or regions or nations. That's the first thing. The second is that I don't believe in this fashionable view now, much goodness has come from it, about human rights. I think there's one human right, and that is about the right to life and to live, and with self-interest to try and protect yourself. But I believe if you do not base rights on duties, that it's the duties fulfilled that beget rights, you are building your system of rights on sand and not actually on secure ground. And thirdly, despite all the changes we've had in our society, I do believe in human beings there is a sense of a natural morality. And I think you could go through most of the religions of the world, and it wouldn't be that difficult to devise a social highway code, which I think we should actually do. There will be obviously some who follow the Prophet and who are Muslims, whose attitudes to women we would disagree with, but I think in the West we'd probably, in a world convention, we would lose out on whether our views were natural morality or not. And the reason why I think we have a natural morality is one can believe it is God implanted in us, or you could say it's only by certain rules of behaviour that we've managed to survive, and that we've actually learnt the hard way what the basic ground rules are. So the first thing is that we are a fallen nature, but with the potential to being redeemed, that duties have to be fulfilled before rights can be bestowed in any meaningful and long-term and secure way. And thirdly, implanted in our nature is a natural sense of morality. And what does that mean for welfare? Nick was immensely polite of describing what governments have been doing and talking about the state of play we're in now with this, what Ian Duncan Smith, who's a good man who's fallen among a silly idea, has been promoting this universal credit. Well, I've never said this in church before. The universal credit won't happen. It's like Mary Tudor's phantom pregnancy. The nearer he gets to the time when he has to launch and produce this new baby, the more the effort is, the more frantic the behaviour is, and we all know what happened to poor Mary Tudor's phantom pregnancy. And this extraordinary beast that he's trying to create won't occur. There'll be efforts along the lines that Nick has described, but at some stage, I think we have to go back to those three guiding principles, if that's not too grand a term, that I've mentioned, about we're fallen but capable of behaving well, that duties have to be performed before one can secure rights on any scale and for any time. And then thirdly, there is within us a natural morality. And I do think, though Nick was polite in saying that this is almost, we're at the end of a welfare system based on national insurance, I believe that that is the long-term future if we are to have a welfare state. And therefore it's beholden to us to start pushing the reforms in that direction. Because a national insurance system, it satisfies self-interest. You're going to cover the emergencies, the dangers, the normal things which will happen as we go through life. There's an altruistic element in it. It doesn't dominate, but we all know when we pay in that there will be some, what a wonderful sound, there will be some that draw much more than us. But we're not barred from drawing if we actually qualify to do so. And I believe also that insurance will become increasingly important with this massive flow of people to different countries, and particularly to advanced countries, in that insurance, national insurance, defines state borders, who are members, and therefore it helps to define nationhood. Now, and again, while Nick was presenting almost, I sensed that he wasn't happy with the growing sense of conditionality. I am enthusiastic about it because I believe that one of the great factors undermining public support for welfare is the belief that people who do not contribute are not playing fair and are drawing disproportionately from the community chest. Now, that is a different issue, and I end on this, if I may, from what your vicar mentioned about an underclass. I certainly have noticed, representing almost the same geographical area for 35 years, which has been for me the most wonderful tutorial anybody could have, given by tutorials some of us learn best, that a mega change now is that it is much more difficult for poorer children to advance, despite all the educational reforms we kid ourselves we have enacted, than when I was a child and as a child who benefited from it. So I welcome this dialogue with Nicholas, because he knows he's the collective memory now of the welfare state. It's a mega task he's undertaken to grapple with what were the ideas leading up to and where have they led us to today. And I think anybody who's a serious reformer cannot be so without being indebted to Nick Timmins. And one of the great things about his book, of course, is that he doesn't prescribe what he thinks. It's rather like the New Testament. The question is thrown back to us. What do we think? And it's up to us to answer the question. And what I've tried to do in my 8 minutes, Mr. Vicar, is to give you my answer to that particular question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fascinating. Can I just be absolutely clear? So conditionality, for these purposes, means conditions attached to the receipt of benefit as opposed to the receipt of benefit by rights. Is that what I understand?
You'd get insurance benefits as of right.
Right.
You get it because you paid the contributions for no other reasons. For the reasons that Nick gave you, that has sunk in importance, and there's been the rise of means-tested assistance, which in its early days was largely unconditional. If you were poor, you got it. There weren't questions. You weren't expected to be attempting to get a job. You weren't expected to find a partner when you were actually, the taxpayer was landed with the bill of looking after you and your family. All of that, it came unconditionally. And the bills rose, and the public got more disquieted about it. But Nick was also suggesting, because there are a growth of conditionality into the insurance side as well. And it's a great debate whether you think if you've paid, then you're right to draw it wherever you do, or in fact, that human nature is such that even when you've earned it, the state's got a right to prod you in certain directions.
Is it actually really insurance? I mean, do the sums of money that actually go into national insurance contributions have any relationship to the welfare budget at all?
It has less so. There's not a fund.
No.
And Beveridge was foolish, I think, to keep making comparisons with industrial insurance. But most people in the country know what national insurance is, and they think they pay for what they get. The pension being the largest, although this government has irresponsibly made it much easier for people to claim their pensions, whatever their record is.
What was there a stage when there was, if not actually a fund, there was a relationship between national insurance contributions?
There was a closer one, but it was never
right.
One
it was
for
never
one.
entirely.
I mean, and it's there's a thing called the fund that sits in the government's accounts, but it's a piece of accounting. It's not a accumulated fund. And it sort of got killed off over the years by both parties because those on the right tended to believe in a means-tested approach, so they whittled down the value of the unemployment benefit, and those on the left tended to credit people in. So you got the benefit without having actually made the contributions.
I was interested in your mention of the Beveridge report, which is 1943, 42?
42, the report.
42. And I read recently, I think it sold out its first edition and rapidly ran into editions and sold 300,000 copies.
It sold huge, yes, I can't remember.
So I think quite a few people have read it.
Quite a few people have bought it.
and I think a small pamphlet was produced for everybody in the armed forces. So it was quite an exciting thing.
And was there not a cabinet discussion whether it should be distributed? People were getting concerned. But the test came for the old idea of insurance. You had to have a fund. The Beveridge thought everybody should pay in before they drew the new old age pension. And the truth was, and Mr. Attlee was pretty good on these things, he thought given the poverty among old people, you couldn't be building up a fund for tomorrow and allowing them to wallow in their poverty. So he abolished the building up the fund, and then from that point onwards, it became a pay-as-you-go scheme. You've got to balance the books each year for the benefits you pay out.
Right. So an opportunity now for everybody here to ask questions, if they would care to do so. So have a think about those. I've got some other questions, but not yet. Madam. Matthew's going to present you with a microphone, and if you feel kindness, you could hold that quite closely to your mouth so that people can hear you well.
I'd just like some clarification then. So most of the welfare benefits are now going to people that are retired. Is that what this is working out to be? So it's not just the shirkers, is it?
So most benefits are going to the retired. You're asking that whether that's a fact?
So I didn't quite catch this.
The most benefits now being paid are going to people who are past retirement age.
Well,
is that the case?
It depends how you do the sum. But yes, if you look at the total of what you might call the benefit bill, the largest single chunk of it comfortably is pensioner benefits of one sort or another.
And some of those, of course, go to everybody. So the heating allowance, £300 a year, will go to the Duke of Buccleuch, will it not?
I mean, the current year.
But it's true that because we're an ageing population, the proportion that's being paid on pensions, and the sums are growing. But the welfare bill for the people of working age can also be growing, but not as fast as that for pensioners. So, I mean, there's been an explosion on both fronts. I'm not saying it's wrong to. I'm just saying if you have a welfare state which teaches the wrong principles, you are acting very foolishly indeed, because another principle, so simple it's hardly worth calling it a principle, that work makes the world go round, and if people don't work, it is very difficult to actually pay the bills. And I think there was a tendency from the 60s onwards where welfare encouraged you to choose between welfare and work rather than working when work was available.
Yeah, these figures won't be quite right because they're coming off the top of my head, but it's something like the benefit bill this year is about 207 billion.
207 billion.
Of which about 50% is pensioner benefits. Only around a fifth of that, about 40 billion, goes to people who are actually out of work for whatever reason, right? So they're unemployed, on disability benefits, lone parents, whose kids are young enough. And the bit in the middle goes to people who are in work or not claiming. So I mean that includes child benefit, for example, which is 12 billion quid of the sum.
Okay. You see, as well as welfare affecting individuals, how they behave, it affects companies and whole industries. In that, when Sir Keith Joseph in the 70s reintroduced Speedhamland, subsidising Speedhamland again, which is subsidies for low wages, the bill was £2 million. Last year, the bill for subsidising low wages, and true, it's not taking account of inflation, was £30,000 million. 30 billion. It's mega. And if you run Tesco's, and Sainsbury's workers are getting their wages subsidised because you've divided the working day up in a way which allows them to maximise the help they will get from taxpayers, you have to be extraordinarily principled to put your shareholders at risk by not behaving the same way. So when there's this debate about people becoming dependent on benefit, it's totally... Dependency can be a noble estate. It can also be, for some of us, not a very desirable estate. But we mustn't forget that one of the dependency groups now are employers who subsidise low wages, and one of the reasons why wages have been pushed down towards the bottom has not been the huge numbers of people coming to this country trying to get jobs, but because the government has been using taxpayers' money to subsidise low wages. And employers and trade unions think, what's the point of getting that? Why work harder? Why get a pay increase when you're losing so much of that in benefits? So it's quite complicated. Once you start interfering in this way, it has all sorts of repercussions which you may think that you were certainly were undreamt of before you started the whole reform process.
Other questions? Sir.
Thanks. I mean, the effects of...
Slightly closer to your mouth, if you would.
The effects of the new universal credit may be adverse and perverse, but in principle, isn't the idea of simplifying things a good one? I mean, the older I get, the more it seems to me I waste an awful lot of my life on bureaucracy, and for a lot of people who are on benefits, it must be it has been incredibly complicated working their way through the system in the past. Isn't that a benefit in its own right?
Can I just direct that to Nick first and ask whether it was ever very simple?
No. No, I mean, it got gradually more complicated over the years, I think. I mean, my answer to your question would be yes. Simply, I don't know how people manage it at the moment. It's immensely complicated. And the idea of simplifying it has to be a good idea. It's the journey to get there that's proving somewhat difficult.
Yeah.
I'm against universal credit, both on principle and in practice. It sounds simple, let's simplify it. It's so simple, the system they've got, they can hardly roll it out. I mean, at the moment in my constituency, I think they've got a handful of single people who've got no savings, who don't pay rent. I mean, it's bizarre, and this is years behind time. Instead of actually trying to work a system from the locality, see whether you can grow it that way, it's yet another reform imposed downward. And I don't think the public sector, maybe the private sector, but they're better at disguising this, are any good at doing major IT programs. And I think this will go the same way as hospital records, the tens of billions of pounds that were wasted on that. That will also happen. I also think it's morally wrong. I actually think we should try and work to an industrial system that pays people wages in which they can look after themselves and their families, and not expect a welfare system to actually add to the downward pressure on wages, which is in fact one of the outcomes of our present system. I think earning one's way and trying to work towards living wages for people, which it's modest enough, but rather difficult to achieve. I mean, in this city, there's no question that the financial sector could not pay everybody a living wage, given the profits there are and what the people at the top get. And we ought to have a legislative system which obviously has a national minimum wage, but has a higher sector minimum wage. And we pick off those sectors which we know from their profit margins could adequately pay higher wages. And we should do that because it's a proper thing for them to do. It's a proper thing for people to get better wages. It's also good for taxpayers because we'd be a lower subsidy to low wages.
Yes. So.
Brilliant, works. Should everyone be employed? So do you think, for example, the work of stay-at-home parents, is that valuable to the economy, and should that be recognised? And should notions of conditionality be attached to that? Or is there value in, for example, things like that where parents choose to stay at home, not go out and earn a wage? Is there value in work that doesn't go through industry or get employed?
So that's really a question about whether work in itself is an essential component of living in society, or whether there are other things people can be doing, like looking after children and so on.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of evidence that work is good for you. There's plenty of other valuable roles that people play in society that don't actually involve paid work. I mean, bringing up children, caring for older people, older relatives. These are valuable roles in society. It seems to be crazy if you demand that everybody had to work. Wouldn't seem to make a great deal of sense. But it's equally clear that on balance, work is good for people. Good for their mental health, as well as their physical health and their independence.
My answer would be that we should actually try and recognise that wherever we can. And one proposal I hoped we'd adopt 2 elections ago was, if you look at the subsidies, taxpayer support to families for children in their first 19 years of life, then the sum came through child benefit and child tax credits, £100,000. And I thought it would, if we're talking about personalising services and public expenditure, parents should be able to say, I'd like to take a quarter of that in the first 2 years of each child's life, because I actually want to stay at home. I don't want to be in wage employment. And given what we now know, it goes back to the rector's comments about an underclass, how important, crucial the first couple of years of a child's life are with bonding and therefore their ability to develop cognitive and social skills. Any policy that encouraged that, I think, would have huge dividends for the nation, but would increase personal happiness. But it's again trusting people to want to do the right thing. Some parents would not want to do that, and I'm against a system which forces people to do things like that. But my guess is most parents, one of them would probably want to stay at home with their child as long as possible, and instead of subsidising that child over 19 years, I don't see why we shouldn't parents be able to say, I will have 3/4 of that subsidy from the age of 3 onwards, but for the first 2 years I want to draw that large lump of money tax-free because we wish to spend it in a different way. And I think we'd have a lot more balanced children as a result of such a policy.
In that context, are there therefore other solutions to ingrained poverty than paying benefits of support or entitlement? Regeneration schemes, for example, in particular cities and places, have had a mixed success, and there would be those who would believe, I think I probably do, that the education system has not actually delivered the levels of aspiration and drive towards social mobility that it might have done. I mean, are there other solutions other than paying people to survive?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, the long-term effects of poverty are not merely about levels of income, are they? They're clearly about levels of education and how you equip people to grow up and cope in their own lives. So clearly there's much about both regeneration, education, housing that has an impact on poverty. You know, but the interesting bit is where do you begin?
Yes. I mean, are we investing too little in those other things and too much in welfare?
I'd pass on that.
Oh.
But I think Frank would have strong opinions about it.
Well, it is true when the rector said I was appointed poverty czar, but it was a typical New Labour move, which so angered me, in that Number 10 hadn't asked me whether I wanted to be the poverty czar before they announced it, that I told them to stuff it. And of course, the truth is I should have kept it and used the title to make life a little bit more difficult for the government speaking as their poverty czar till they sacked me. But the Prime Minister did ask me to do one piece of work, which resulted in a report which was called The Foundation Years, Preventing Poor Children from Becoming Poor Adults. And what we were looking for in this report were what are the driving factors, apart from class or income, which can account why so many poor children become poor adults. And I think we came up with some answers that were well worth a serious try, which we're trying to do in Birkenhead, building up, seeing whether this would work, become a national model. Because what we do know is from longitudinal studies, these great studies that we've done, taking children in a particular year and following them through their life, looking at the 1958 cohort, a person called Feinstein showed that given the abilities children had at 5, we could predict where practically all of them would be and then check where they were when they were in early adulthood. And the link was frighteningly clear. Just as when I was doing this report, you go into a reception class and you would say to the reception teacher, can you tell me who's going to be head girl, who's going to be a barrister, who's going to make money, who's going to find it really difficult to work, who might even be going to prison? And the teachers had no difficulty at all in saying after a few weeks with the children where they would actually end up, and they're right. And therefore the education system, we've got when children enter their reception class, there is this range of abilities which schools do not change. There's the odd examples they do. Schools push everybody up, if you're lucky. They don't narrow those class differences. So it comes back to the question that you asked the 2 questions ago about how important those early stages of life are. And even if you don't think they're the most crucial, those foundation years are what everything else is built on. So the better the job we do, the better the actually outcomes are. And one of the findings we did, which was because we've got Cambridge University to devise a series of indicators, but one, starting school successfully, which they want to change because teachers don't like the title, but everybody knows what those words mean. And we found that there were a group of very poor children who were up with the rich children. And when you try to distinguish why, they all reported they had fun at home. Oh. Now, obviously fun with children starts to engage this whole process of developing their social and cognitive abilities. And for doing intervention programs, we all know if you're Guardian readers and you sit and read and get your children to read, this is wonderful for their children's advance. But if you can't read in the first place, how do you actually start that intervention? But if in fact it's about fun, engaging with your child, talking with your child, growing your child's brain in that way, it seems we might have just one of them, a number of instances of breaking that cycle, which I think has become more marked in that the working class fell onto what was the really best way to raise children, which was tough love. You actually set clear guidelines, you kept them in those guidelines, and in those guidelines you love them to the best of your abilities. And I think we was witnessing in Birkenhead, I think as a nation we've fallen out of actually being rather good parents. It's been thought to be, you've got to be somehow special. Average parents can make all the difference to their children's life chances. Oh. They just need to know how to do it. If you've lost the practical knowledge, because your own parents never taught you in the first place.
Another perhaps final question? Well, then from me then. You've talked to, oh, pardon me, yes, another question here.
Do you think in the future we will end up more like America and how they deal with their welfare class over there? Because their structure is so depressing. I mean, from the point of view, they're not allowed to have cash. They have to have a card to be able to take money out of the bank to pay for necessities like rent and water. And they have the food tokens, which obviously don't amount to much, but is just enough to feed your children on. Do you think we are slipping into those sort of parallels over here because it's getting harder for people?
Very good question. Are you as expert on the American system as you are on the British?
I'm not going to be expert either. No, but absolutely not. Well, there's clearly some transfer across because these ideas get, I mean, the whole idea of welfare to work is not a British idea or an American idea. It gets adopted around the world. And so you see these, what you might call public policy ideas, come around and go about. And some of that came from America, but it also came from Australia and elsewhere. So there'll be some read across. But I don't think you necessarily end up exactly like America. It's a very different society. It has a completely different view of the way the world works, doesn't it? In America, if you go bust, you're given another chance and expected to carry on. Here, if you go bankrupt, it tends to be a bit of a write-off, different attitudes. American society expects people to stand on their own 2 feet, and you can see the results of that. So it produces some fantastic individuals, fantastic achievements, and it ends up with a bunch of people who do extremely badly indeed, because it's a much less egalitarian society than this one, even though you wouldn't remotely describe this as an egalitarian society.
Right.
I don't disagree with that, but I think there's certain aspects with the food stamps and food banks and so on which we need to be careful about where that actually leads to. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to see food banks, but by Jove, if you're actually down on your luck and wanting food, they're a godsend. But how do we actually make reforms so they're unnecessary rather than the gesture of the cheap political gesture of saying we should actually close them all. But I think I suppose my final comment is another observation over 35 years. I do think the bottom of our society is falling away. I think it's much harder for decent people at the bottom now than it has been before. Partly because of the industrial changes that Nick was hinting at. I think the job opportunities have changed and so on. I think being up against highly educated Eastern Europeans for semi-skilled jobs who you don't get in that sort of labour market, you don't get a look in. Any sensible employer will choose the more able person, even if they're overqualified, whatever that means for the job. I think this puts British workers at a huge disadvantage. And the income changes that Nick talked about, I think are life-determining for people at the bottom. Yeah.
I think a rather happy aspect of the food bank in Bow that we are involved in is that actually they're beginning to recognise that the people coming forward, even after just a few weeks of their life, that they can begin to offer them mentoring and numeracy skills. And so actually it's actually producing people who can. Thank you very much for your attention. The title for this evening's dialogue or debate, The Poor You Have Always With You, is of course from Mark chapter 14:7, and is it from the context of Jesus being anointed by a woman and the disciples objecting to the expenditure of money. And some conservative forces have used that saying of Jesus to imply that actually there's nothing you can do about it. That, of course, is not a logical consequence of what Jesus was saying, which is that we still have a reason and a duty to help them. What we've discovered this evening from Nick Timmins and Frank Field is the enormous complexity in terms of morality, public policy, theology, and economics of dealing with these problems. And we're really grateful to you for your knowledge and your fluency and for sharing your thoughts. Thank you very much.